Hey guys, how's it going? So today we're going to be talking about the perk called Nocturnal. Now as you would assume, the Nocturnal perk increases the amount of damage your weapon does at night and reduces it during the day. And as you can see, it's 12:41 p.m. and my 6 crank laser musket with the Nocturnal perk is doing only 21 damage, whereas a regular laser musket is actually doing 64 damage. Now what's interesting about this perk description is it doesn't really give you any numbers, and it doesn't really tell you how much it increases at night and how much it decreases during the day. Now luckily it's pretty easy to test this because all you have to do is look at the high and low points of the damage. The high point occurs at midnight and the low point occurs at midday. And then between the times 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., the damages converge onto what is known as the base damage. Now I use two different weapons in my testing. I have a Nocturnal 6 crank laser musket, as I said before, and I also have a Nocturnal Fat Man. Now what's really interesting about this is it turns out the Nocturnal 6 crank laser musket actually functions the way it should, where the perk increases and decreases the damage throughout the day. However, this doesn't really happen with the Fat Man because I didn't see barely any fluctuation in the damage. Now as you can see, the Nocturnal Fat Man is sitting at a low of 523, and at midnight it goes up to 555. However, the Nocturnal laser musket is sitting at a low of 21, and it actually goes up to a high of 128. So the Nocturnal Fat Man really only has a damage variance of about 32 damage, whereas the laser musket has a damage variance of about 107. So I think there might be a bug with the Nocturnal perk on the Fat Man, or maybe it's just with explosive weapons in general. I'm not really sure, but it didn't really test correctly. Alright, so now that we have that out of the way, let's look at the numbers I got from my testing. So the way I tested this was I basically looked at the amount of damage the Nocturnal weapon was doing, and then I also looked at what time it was doing that specific damage. So as you guys saw earlier, it was about noon, and I was doing 21 damage with my laser musket, and the base damage of the laser musket is 64, so 21 is about 33% of that, so it's safe to say we do 33% base damage at noon with the Nocturnal weapon. Now if we go back in time 6 hours, we actually have 42 damage out of 64, which is 66% of our base damage. Now it's kind of weird, but at about 8:30 p.m., as we're getting into the night, it actually has 100% base damage, so it's basically like any other weapon. Then once we get past 9 p.m., we actually have 100 damage out of 64, so that means we're doing about 156% of our base damage. And then from 9 p.m. all the way until midnight, once we cross the midnight threshold, we actually get 128 damage out of 64, which is actually 200% of our base damage. And then what's interesting about Nocturnal weapons is from midnight till 6 a.m., we have basically 2 times base damage for every single shot of our weapon. And this is the same 2 times damage you would see on an instigating weapon, but instead of just for enemies with full health, it's for enemies with any type of health, and it's for every one of your shots. And that was basically the extent of my testing. So you can actually have as little as 33% of your base damage at noon, which is obviously midday, the least amount of damage you're going to get. And then at midnight, which is where the Nocturnal weapons are the strongest, you can actually do 200% base damage, or, just 2 times your normal damage. So for 6 out of 24 hours, about a quarter of the day, you can do an insane amount of damage with Nocturnal weapons. But as you get further into the day, they just become more worthless and you just don't want to use them whatsoever. Now something else I wanted to mention is there is a magazine that increases your damage by 5% when it deems it's nighttime, and I think the game deems it's nighttime at about 8:30, but what's funny is it actually deems it's daytime at about 4 a.m. So between midnight and 4 a.m. I actually had 134 damage on my Nocturnal laser musket, but the base damage was actually 67 instead of 64. So we still had 200% base damage, but it was just a slightly higher number. So all in all, the magazine didn't really affect our calculations, and because we're working with percents, it wouldn't really matter if it increased it by 10% or 15%, because it would affect both numbers. And also, I'm not really sure about the Fat Man. I was hoping it would get to over like 1,000 damage, because it normally has about 500. So I think that would have been really interesting to see, but unfortunately, the Nocturnal perk just doesn't really work on the Fat Man. I'm not sure about other heavy weapons or explosive weapons like the Fat Man, because I don't have a Nocturnal version, but nonetheless it is quite interesting because it shows that there could be some underlying bugs with the Nocturnal perk. So all in all, I would still say Instigating is probably a better perk to have on most of your weapons, because it basically does the same amount of damage over a greater period of time, so you're just going to get more damage out of an Instigating perk. But I would say finding out these actual numbers, the Nocturnal perk has actually become a little bit more valuable to me, because if it is between midnight and 6 AM, you can actually do more damage than pretty much any other weapon. Alright guys, well that about does it for the video, so hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, make sure you leave a like and share, it really helps out the video's performance. Also, if you're new to my channel, make sure you subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.
Got a doll baby, I love her so. Nothing else like her anywhere you go. A man, she's